Hello and welcome back. So in the last lesson, we served up our localhost 8000, which is our Gatsby application. And in it, we saw that right away, we have these two pages. This first page has this little astronaut picture on it, and the second page is just a welcome to page 2 that we can navigate back to page 1. Now, this is really interesting because this actually allows us to highlight one of the key features in Gatsby, which is that inside of this pages folder, as long as you add a new file here, Gatsby will automatically try to load a new page for you, meaning that it will build a new page based on the title of the file that you write. And inside of this file, index.js, this is actually our astronaut page. And what it is just importing React, and it's a functional component that leverages this link. Now, this link component that we get from Gatsby is pretty much a Gatsby version of the React router link, meaning that navigation happens with this link component. We also import this layout, image, and SEO component. Now, these are just components that come by default with Gatsby, and they're actually quite simple. The layout component essentially wraps around some bunch of HTML elements or components, and it provides some styling to it, as well as it provides it some data that we'll look at a little later. The image component allows us to do lazy loading with images and optimizing those images. It's just a Gatsby methodology that makes images more performant on the web. And then the SEO component is meant exactly for search engine optimizations. You can pass it a title, a description, a lang, a meta, or any of these other properties that you see right here. So what this does is it makes search engine crawlers more performant for our website so that we show up higher when people might be Googling for things related to what we write inside of our blog. Now, we will use some of these components when we actually build out our blog posts, but for now, let's go back to looking at our pages folder. So as I explained earlier, if you add a new file, Gatsby will generate a new route for you inside of your application based on the name of the file that you created. So let's actually just make a new file called page3.js. You can name this whatever you want, but I'm just going to call it page 3. I'm going to take this code from page 2 and just remove some things that we don't need. And what I'm going to do is simply just generate an h1, rename this to third page, and then say hello from the third page. Now, as long as we export something out that is a component as the default from this file, Gatsby will know to use this component for that route. So let's test this out. If we go back to our application and navigate to our new page 3, we'll see that we have our hello from the third page. So this is what's really great about Gatsby. It's really easy to build new routes and new pages just by adding files to our pages folder and making sure we export as the default some component that allows Gatsby to use that as the page that it's trying to render. Now, another great thing we actually get with our pages is access to this 404. Now, this 404 page, Gatsby will automatically know to use in live production if the user navigates to some page that doesn't exist. So inside of our development server, if we go to say something like this, we'll see that it takes us to a page that tells us actually all of the routes we have available to access. But in live production, it will end up showing this 404 page. And this is one of the nice things about using Gatsby. For a more opinionated framework like this, it has made a lot of these decisions for us in terms of how to handle routing, how to set up pages, because unlike a normal React application that just rolls with React, you have to include all of the different libraries that you want to include in order to handle routing, in order to handle 404s. As you'll see inside of our course, we have to make those decisions for ourselves. But with Gatsby, you just have to learn how Gatsby does certain things and then follow along with the way that Gatsby has set up the project. So for us in this case, it's just a matter of how do we handle the pages that we want to add to our application. So conceptually, we just have to keep this in mind. If we want to make new pages, we add them into this page folder, and the page route will be named whatever name we've given to our files. Now, this does bring me to a very important caveat about Gatsby. Because Gatsby builds all of our static pages ahead of time, we do not dynamically compose them, which means that the way that you're used to structuring your React code is going to be a little different. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is that every one of our pages is wrapped inside of our layout component. And the layout component we get with Gatsby with this starter project. Now, the reason for this is because we need to actually render the header and the footer and any consistent styling between the pages every single time. Now, why is it this way? Well, if you remember in the last lesson, we talked about Gatsby being a static site generator, meaning that Gatsby needs to actually build those pages on the build step, meaning that it generates every single page's complete HTML that the user needs on their browser in order to view the page. So if we want this header and footer on every single page that we have, including our route, including page 2, and including the new page 3 component that we built and any other further page, we need to always provide it with all of the components and all of the styling for that page on that page's code. This is different from a typical React application where you might have different levels of components that will house the routes that hold the subsequent nested components inside, as you might see when you build something in React using a library like React Router DOM. In React Router DOM, you might have a high-level app component that has route components inside that will then lead to further nested trees of components, meaning that you don't have to actually dynamically compose this code every single time in every single component if you want to render a header. Again, this is a caveat of statically generated websites because statically generated websites need to generate static HTML for every single page. So how you want that page to look needs to have everything on it already in order for it to generate that page. So hopefully that makes sense because that's a big caveat about building our pages inside of Gatsby. Now, with that in mind, one other thing about the layout is we'll see here that we are using a little bit of GraphQL. Now, you might be familiar with everything here, especially if you've taken the course, as we learned with GraphQL. The difference here is that Gatsby has provided its own hook called useStaticQuery. useStaticQuery is a custom hook that Gatsby wrote that allows you to extract the value of whatever query you're making against the GraphQL in order to pluck out the data. Now, as you can see here, what their query is querying is this thing called site with this object that calls for the metadata. Now, this metadata is what we saw inside of our Gatsby config. This site metadata contains a title, description, and author by default, which you can pull off using GraphQL and adding that query that we saw in the layout component. And by doing so, we're now able to pluck off that title that we've stored in our config and then render it inside of this layout component so that we don't have to fetch it inside of every single one of our page components. Now, for example, if we wanted to change the title, if we go to our config object and we change the title here to Yihua's blog, we'll actually see that we get that update. So that's one of the great things as well, is that if we wanted to keep something on our website that we needed to use consistently on all of our pages, probably through our layout of some kind, we can easily just change it inside of the site metadata. Now, we're definitely going to take a deeper look at the GraphQL section that comes with Gatsby, and we're going to do that in the next lesson. So I will see you in the next lesson.